Hey heroes, and welcome to another patriotic episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelate. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. This week's tale is about a boy from Boise, Idaho named William Burnside. Born circa 1929, Burnside's early childhood occurred during the Great Depression, but then when he was around 11 years old, he was fascinated by the emergence of the super soldier Captain America. Now, I'm sure most of you are at least passingly familiar with his origins, but as a quick recap, he was once a frail, scrawny boy named Steve Rogers who volunteered to participate in the US government's Operation Rebirth. In this project, Rogers was injected with a super soldier serum developed by Professor Abraham Erskine, also known by the code name Dr. Reinstein. Rogers was then bombarded with something called Vita Rays to stabilize and complete the process, elevating his strength, speed, and stamina to the height of physical perfection. However, Operation Rebirth had been infiltrated by Nazi spies, including one Major Albrecht Kerfoot, who attempted to copy Erskine's formula. Now, he seemingly succeeded in this task, but Erskine had never committed the entirety of his formula to paper, leaving Kerfoot's reproduction incomplete. Furthermore, before the process could be repeated for anyone else, Abraham Erskine was assassinated by Nazi agent Heinz Kruger, and the secrets of the super soldier serum seemingly died with him. Now, Kruger was inadvertently killed in an ensuing scuffle with the freshly empowered and, at the time, inexperienced Steve Rogers. Kerfoot, meanwhile, faked his death to avoid being discovered by American authorities. He sent a report back to Berlin so the Nazis could begin working on their own super soldier program, but was ultimately killed by his own superiors to prevent anyone else from learning what he knew. Aware that Kerfoot may have written parts of the formula in his notes, the Nazi agents also packed up his books and shipped them back to Germany. Of course, in the wake of all that, Steve Rogers became Captain America and defended the United States against Axis agents alongside his young partner, a special operative by the name of Bucky Barnes. Practically worshipping the patriotic hero William Burnside, watched every newsreel, read every article he could get his hands on, and became an ardent member of Captain America's fan club, the Sentinels of Liberty. Naturally, many of Cap's exploits during the Second World War were widely publicized for propaganda purposes, and while certain details were not made public, including his true identity of Steve Rogers, most Americans were at least aware of the Star-Spangled Hero and his teenage sidekick. They fought in various battles both at home and abroad, worked alongside other heroes as members of the Invaders, and repeatedly clashed with the notorious Nazi agent known as the Red Skull. Now, near the end of the war, in April of 1945, Adolf Hitler entrusted the Red Skull with a locked strongbox that, unbeknownst to anyone but Hitler himself, contained memorabilia and personal belongings, like artwork, manuscripts, and his Iron Cross from the First World War. However, that box was lost during a battle with Captain America and his allies, the Spirit of 76, William Naslund, and the Patriot, Jeffrey Mace. It was actually that same battle that left the Red Skull trapped underground and presumed dead, and kept alive by an experimental suspended animation gas given to him by his associate Baron Wolfgang von Strucker. Not long after that, Captain America and Bucky attempted to stop another foe, Baron Heinrich Zemo, from launching an experimental drone plane, only for the plane to explode over the Atlantic Ocean, seemingly killing Bucky and throwing Captain America into the frigid waters below. At the time, of course, nobody was aware that thanks to the super soldier serum in his blood, Cap's frozen body was forced into a state of suspended animation. While Bucky's body was found and taken by the Soviets, Captain America remained undiscovered, and thus both men were presumed dead by American authorities. Now, in the wake of this, President Truman assigned the Spirit of 76, William Naslund, and a young man named Fred Davis to take over the roles of Captain America and Bucky respectively. Those two fought as members of the Invaders at the very end of World War II, after which the team was reorganized into the All-Winners Squad. Now, William Naslund was killed in action in 1946 and replaced by the Patriot Jeffrey Mace, who took over the mantle of Captain America, but by the end of 1949, the All-Winners Squad disbanded and Mace retired soon thereafter. In the midst of all of this, William Burnside's passion for Captain America developed into an obsession as he dedicated himself to studying the life of the original hero. In 1952, he earned a PhD in American history with a thesis that largely focused on Captain America. Even so, everything he knew to that point was from a distinctly American perspective, and in order to learn even more, he decided to investigate what Axis intelligence reports had documented. To this end, he traveled to Germany in early 1953 and spent weeks poring through old Nazi records, most of which hadn't been touched since the war. Then, in March of that year, while reading through one of Albrecht Kerfoot's notebooks, he came upon the incomplete record of Erskine's original super soldier formula. With the United States in the midst of the Korean War at the time, Burnside realized that he had a unique opportunity, and quickly made his way to Washington. However, he refused to actually give the formula to the government, insisting that if it was used on anyone, it would be used on him. Curious to see if what he claimed was true, government officials had Burnside produce and provide a sample of the serum to test on a laboratory monkey. And although the formula was incomplete, the test appeared to be successful, granting the animal greatly enhanced strength. Of course, government scientists immediately attempted to recreate the serum by studying the affected monkey's blood, but this proved to be infeasible, just as it was with Rogers' original blood samples. Not wanting to lose this opportunity, government officials did a thorough background check on William Burnside before ultimately deciding to acquiesce to his demands, and started plans to let him take on the role of Captain America in the Korean War. In preparation for this, Burnside was granted access to classified documents and recordings, including information on the original Captain America's secret identity of Steve Rogers. However, Burnside decided that he wanted the general public to believe that he was the genuine Captain America, and underwent surgery to look and sound nearly identical to the real Steve Rogers. Fully committed to the idea of actually becoming his idol, he even legally changed his name to Stephen Rogers. Before he could assume the mantle of Captain America, however, the Korean War came to an end on July 27, 1953. The American military no longer had any use for a patriotic superhero, and in the interest of international cooperation, any plans for a new Captain America were shelved. Dejected but ultimately forced to accept this decision, the former William Burnside used his history degree to begin teaching at the Lee School in Connecticut as Professor Steve Rogers. It was there that he met a young boy named Jack Monroe, an adolescent student at the Lee School who was also very interested in the history of Captain America. In fact, not only did Monroe bear a passing resemblance to Cap's partner, Bucky Burns, but he had even taken to calling himself by the same nickname, Bucky. Much like his namesake, this Bucky was also a scrappy youth, and Monroe sometimes got into fights with other students who questioned the validity of stories about Captain America's exploits. Meanwhile, Burnside relished the opportunity to talk about his hero as well as his own discoveries, and Monroe hung on his every word. Monroe even made a replica costume for his new mentor, but as much as Burnside wanted to wear it, he didn't want to defy the federal government, and accepted that Captain America was no longer needed. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Premier Georgy Malenkov embarked on a plan to capitalize on the notorious reputation of the Red Skull. With the real skull missing since the closing days of the war, Malenkov assigned his agent, Albert Malik, to usurp his identity, making it seem as though the Red Skull had abandoned Nazism and was now embracing communist ideology. Furthermore, Malenkov tasked Malik with retrieving Adolf Hitler's lost strongbox, mistakenly believing that it contained blueprints for secret Nazi weapons. As it turns out, at some point the box was found and hidden by a Nazi soldier who attempted to sell its location to the United Nations. And so Malik, in the guise of the Red Skull, made his debut outing by launching an attack on the UN building in New York, and holding the delegates hostage. Sure enough, live news coverage of the incident claimed that the Red Skull had returned and joined forces with Soviet Russia, just as Malik and Malenkov intended. Of course, this news was just the push that Professor Steve Rogers needed to finally follow in the footsteps of his namesake. Pulling into a lonely alley, he donned the costume prepared by his young ally, Jack Monroe, who similarly dressed himself in the same clothes as the original Bucky Barnes. Furthermore, it seemed that Burnside had not only kept the super soldier serum that he'd produced using Kerfoot's notes, but he had enough remaining for 2 injections, and offered the second dose to Jack Monroe, who eagerly agreed. Interestingly, this altered formula had an even greater effect on Burnside and Monroe than Erskine's original treatment did on Steve Rogers, endowing both recipients with superhuman strength, although in Monroe's case this eventually proved to be temporary. Declaring that Captain America and Bucky had returned, the two heroes rushed to the UN building and confronted the imposter Red Skull, Albert Malik, who was shocked to see the wartime hero seemingly back from the dead. Burnside and Monroe quickly defeated and unmasked the communist Skull, saving the captive UN delegates in the process. However, Malik escaped from the authorities and embarked on other schemes before eventually fleeing to Algeria, where he operated his own criminal organization for decades, although he never did succeed in claiming Hitler's strongbox. In the meantime, as Captain America and Bucky, Burnside and Monroe continued battling foreign agents and even began working alongside government agencies like the FBI and the US Army, as they embarked on what was initially a successful heroic career. While lacking the vibranium shield of the original Captain America, Burnside wielded a bulletproof steel version. It's also interesting to note that Burnside's costume was subtly different from his predecessors in that the red and white stripes on his midsections were only on the front of the suit and not on the back. He and Monroe exposed a number of Soviet operatives, such as Luna Lupov, aka the Executioner, who targeted America's experimental atomic cannon, and Professor Steve Standish, who attempted to turn Captain America into a communist with his so-called virus of evil, which failed to work thanks to the super soldier serum in his system. They clashed with a hatchet-wielding assassin from China known as the Man with No Face, and battled a superhuman Soviet agent named Ivan Kronov, better known as the 1950s Electro. Naturally, these conflicts and the larger Cold War further shaped Burnside's political views, making him increasingly zealous in his anti-communist sentiments. As he uncovered more Soviet spies, his vigilance began to devolve into paranoia, which was worsened by the fact that neither he nor Monroe had received the Vita-Ray treatment that was used to stabilize the original Captain America's transformation. As a result of all of this, Burnside started seeing enemies everywhere, particularly those who, in his words, weren't pure-blooded Americans. By July of 1954, he and Monroe had begun attacking innocent African-American civilians, accusing them of being communists. There were scattered instances of this over several months, and by late 1955 the federal government had taken notice. Suspecting that the unstable super-soldier serum was affecting their minds, government officials approached Burnside and Monroe, offering them a chance to surrender and turn themselves in for treatment. However, the two rogue heroes refused, and the authorities took them into custody, while the government officially disavowed their actions. Government scientists attempted to cure them of their madness, but to no avail, and in the end Burnside and Monroe were placed into suspended animation for further study, under the top-secret cryogenics program Deep Freeze. Then, in 1958, there was an incident in which their cryogenic capsules were found and stolen by Soviet agents, but they were soon retrieved by FBI agent Jimmy Woo and his superhuman allies. After that, the two pods were placed under lock and key, and went largely forgotten about for decades. Then eventually came the Marvel Age, in which a new generation of heroes emerged, and the original Captain America was found and revived by the Avengers. Several years later, one of the men in charge of watching over the cryogenic capsules became increasingly incensed by then recent political developments. Now, obviously the details of his grievances would have to have been altered by the sliding time scale, but it's not hard to imagine a government employee having issues with the political climate in virtually any era. But regardless, this disgruntled right-winger believed that men like William Burnside were what America needed, and revived both him and Jack Monroe. The two were led to believe that the official Captain America was a traitor, but didn't know that he was the original, instead thinking him to be another replacement like Naslund or Mace before them. They traveled to New York to confront the other Cap, but as luck would have it, they just missed him, as the real Steve Rogers had left to vacation in the Bahamas with his girlfriend Sharon Carter. And so instead, the two imposters started attacking civilians in Harlem in order to lure the real Captain America's partner Sam Wilson, aka the Falcon, into a trap. Naturally, Sam was shocked to see someone who looked and sounded nearly identical to his friend behaving in such a manner, but it didn't take long for him to realize that this was an imposter, as evidenced by the subtle difference in their costumes. Overpowered by two super soldiers, Wilson was taken captive and interrogated by Burnside and Monroe. However, the Falcon's abduction was witnessed by members of the community, who gathered others and came to his aid. While the intervention of the assembled Harlemites allowed Wilson to break free, Burnside and Monroe ultimately escaped and infiltrated Avengers Mansion long enough to learn the real Captain America's location. Tracking their target down, they used Monroe's passing resemblance to Bucky Barnes to take the real Rogers by surprise and knock him out. This then led to a battle in the Bahamas involving William Burnside, Jack Monroe, Sharon Carter, and Sam Wilson, who had followed them there. But in the end, the imposter Captain America and Bucky were able to overpower their foes and take Wilson, Carter, and Rogers captive, before revealing who they really were. Burnside then took Rogers to Miami, Florida, so that he could challenge him to a final public battle on American soil, but in the ensuing fight, Burnside came to realize that his foe was not another successor, but the genuine Captain America. Shaken by this revelation, the already mentally unstable Burnside flew into a mad frenzy, but in the end the real Steve Rogers was able to deliver a powerful blow that ended the fight. In the wake of this, the real Steve was also shaken and left to reckon with the fact that he could never fully control what people thought he and America stood for. After that conflict, the federal government had Burnside and Monroe sent to a mental institution in the Catskill Mountains. Unbeknownst to the authorities, however, this facility was secretly controlled by a criminal organization known as the Corporation, and managed by the megalomaniacal psychiatrist Johann Fenhoff, better known as Dr. Faustus. At the time developing a gas that allowed him to control the minds of others, Faustus tested his chemical on William Burnside, demonstrating its efficacy by having the former hero shoot and kill his own partner. In truth, the gun he used had been loaded with blanks, and so Monroe actually survived and was later sent to a Shield-run hospital in Washington, where he eventually recovered from his chemically induced insanity. But the important thing is that Burnside believed that he had murdered his longtime friend. After that, Faustus continued to manipulate Burnside, making him the grand director of a neo-Nazi hate group he'd established known as National Force. Disturbingly, each member of this group wore a suit that allowed them to immolate themselves with the press of a button to avoid capture. In the masked identity of the Grand Director, Burnside was sent to lead a rally in Central Park, where Faustus unleashed his gas on the crowd, using it to incite a riot. This, however, was merely the opening salvo in a larger scheme by Faustus to take control of the entire population of New York. They even successfully mind-controlled the real Captain America, forcing him to join the National Force as well. However, he ultimately regained his faculties and turned against Faustus thanks to the intervention of the vigilante Daredevil. Ironically, in the midst of all of this, Burnside began to question his own racist beliefs, and of course, beneath the mind control, he never actually wanted Dr. Faustus to succeed. And so when Faustus attempted to use him against Captain America, Burnside stopped himself by activating his suit's suicide switch. And of course, in the end, the real Steve Rogers and his allies succeeded in stopping Dr. Faustus, and most of the remaining members of National Force were arrested. But while he had sustained noticeable burns on the left side of his body, Burnside survived and was secretly taken away by Faustus's agents. Now, I will note that after this, Burnside's spirit was supposedly seen fighting in Mephisto's Arena of Lost Souls, but, Hell Lords aren't exactly known for being trustworthy, so it's entirely possible that he was never actually there. In any event, Burnside was sealed away and spent several years recovering from his injuries. Now, in that time, the original Bucky Barnes returned, having been transformed by the Russians into a brainwashed assassin known as the Winter Soldier. Controlled by the Russian general Alexander Lukin, the Winter Soldier was sent to assassinate the original Red Skull, Johann Schmidt. Lukin also directed Bucky to kill his 1950s counterpart Jack Monroe in an attempt to frame him for the Skull's murder. But in the end, Captain America uncovered the truth and helped free his old friend from his brainwashing. Furthermore, the Red Skull survived his assassination attempt by using a cosmic cube to transfer his mind into the body of the man who ordered his murder to begin with, Alexander Lukin. This brings us back to the story at hand, as the Skull then joined forces with Dr. Faustus. In one of their schemes together, they orchestrated the apparent assassination of the original Captain America, brainwashing Sharon Carter into shooting him with a special weapon that seemingly killed him while trapping his consciousness in the time stream. If you're wondering why he didn't just kill him outright, it's because the Skull's ultimate goal was to take over Steve's body, but he never actually succeeded in that part. In the meantime, the mantle of Captain America was passed to the former Winter Soldier, Bucky Barnes. After that, Dr. Faustus and the Red Skull also secretly propped up Senator Gordon Wright, who split from his previous political party to form his own, the Third Wing Party. Wright also announced that he would be running for the presidency, but behind the scenes he was a little more than a shill for the Red Skull's fascist ideology. To bolster Wright's political career, Faustus had Burnside once again become Captain America and pose as the real Steve Rogers to publicly support Senator Wright. Of course, this whole situation led to a conflict between the two Captain Americas, and Burns figured out who the phony Steve Rogers actually was when Burnside accused him of killing Bucky. Realizing that he was referring to Jack Monroe, Barnes apologized, hoping to help Burnside. Burnside, however, was angry and confused after learning who his foe was, and while attempting to flee, he was recaptured by the Red Skull's forces. Bucky and his allies, meanwhile, used this as an opportunity to follow and to learn the Skull's location, ultimately putting an end to his and Faustus's schemes once again. In the confusion, William Burnside slipped away and laid low for a time. He was forced to reckon with the fact that not only was the world different from the one he knew, but that he himself was not the man that he longed to emulate. While on the run and avoiding capture, he visited the real Steve's old ally, Peggy Carter, and had her recount old war stories. He ultimately returned home to Boise, Idaho, and started going by his real name of William Burnside for the first time since 1953, a name that nobody else even knew. But then, when he saw that the house he'd grown up in had been torn down and replaced by a strip mall that had since gone out of business, he felt his anger swell up once again, and wondered what had happened to his America. The following day, he donned his Captain America costume once again to foil a bank robbery. This was witnessed by members of the far-right paramilitary group, the Watch Dogs, who recruited him into their pack. With a small army backing him up, Burnside embarked on a plan to reclaim America, which ultimately led to another conflict with Bucky Barnes, who Burnside captured and forced to wear his original wartime costume. In the end, Bucky and the Falcon thwarted Burnside's attempt to blow up the Hoover Dam, and Burnside himself was presumed dead after being shot and falling into the water below. But thanks to his enhanced physiology, Burnside survived yet again, and after recovering, attempted to go back into action. By this point, however, the real Steve Rogers had returned and resumed the role of Captain America, and so this time it was he who confronted Burnside. Enraged and confused, Burnside attempted to flee but ran into the street and was hit by an oncoming semi-truck. He was badly injured, but Rogers brought him to a secret SHIELD hospital to recover. With the general public still believing Burnside dead, Rogers decided to keep it that way and held a funeral for him at Arlington National Cemetery, honoring what he had done before the incomplete super soldier serum had affected his mind. Then, after 6 weeks of recovery, Burnside finally awakened in the hospital, and Rogers visited him, allowing Rogers to really say his piece for the first time. In the end, Rogers told Burnside that his mission was over, and that it was time for him to stand down. The following day, he would be brought to a different hospital where he would be given a new name and a new lease on life. Rogers then departed, leaving his doppelganger behind in the hopes that Burnside's madness could finally be treated, thus bringing an end to the checkered career of the 1950s Captain America. That also brings an end to this video because that's all I've got for you this week, and thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!